Hey, deserving listeners, let's watch and see what comes flying out of my face.
Me. Basically, I'm gatekeeping you from all the other girls. I'm only getting ready just to be my best self for your dates. I can't wait for you to take me on vacation to Honduras.
Okay, so I believe him that he remembers those statements. And there's a possibility that she meant it when she said it. There's a possibility that in the moment he was close to number one or tied for number one or even number one. And she said those things. You know, they're in there for hours and hours. So things are going to happen. And the things that he's remembering, again, could be distorted a little bit. Well, now I'm worried because Madison seems like the sort of person that isn't going to take this lying down. So I'm guessing that Madison's going to let him have it for this. Now, I guess what I hope, if this is true, or at least a version of the truth, that Madison would say, yeah, Mason, I'm sorry that I think you're telling me that I led you on to believe that I was going to pick you. And when I rewatch it, I can see that. But I'll tell you, I was confused and I really was having a hard time figuring out between the two of you. And there were times when I really wanted to run away with you to Honduras, and I said it. And there were times when you said things to me. You know, we both had moments where we were very explicit with each other about our care of each other and our connection. You know, I'll tell you, I wasn't trying to lie. I wasn't trying to lead you on. And it was, well, what I was going to say is, it was really hard for me when I broke up with you. She did not seem like it was hard for her. When she goes back to the lounge, she was celebrating it. It was delicious. It tastes so good. So anyway, you would think he would have something to say about that. He would say like, and maybe he will.
Very, very validating things, which felt good to hear. And I love love. So if I'm falling for someone, I'm all in. So this experiment was kind of a nightmare for me for dating multiple women. I would have loved to validate Meg the way that I was validating Madison, because she really deserved it.
Yeah, I think I said this, that Mason might actually be the sort of person that has a really hard time managing having feelings for two different people at the same time. For some people, obviously polyamorous people, it's at least more comfortable. There's a myth that polyamorous people are totally fine with non-monogamy. They never get jealous and everything is clean and comfortable. And certainly there can be more comfort, but there also can be the normal discomfort. It's like, what do I do with this? And this love threatened this other one. And jealousy absolutely does happen in polyamorous relationships. They just have ways of processing it and talking about it and working together. Typically, there's a roadmap for that. Anyway, I used to specialize in that kind of work. I suppose I still do, but it's been a bit since I've worked with full-on polycules. But anyway, so I was wondering if for Mason it was kind of looking like he just was having a really hard time navigating, because he seemed really locked up a lot. He just seemed really like he was freezing, you know, like the gears were locking up, and so he seems to be maybe validating that.
And I think it really shows, looking back in the experiment, how great of a connection we had. And it hurt to see some of that back and wishing I was saying that to a different person on the other side of the wall.
Obviously, I did have different relationships with Alex and Mason, and I think that's really normal.
Yeah, that's a great start. Yeah. I think they edited Alex's full statement because he got into it and then immediately they are going to Mason. So maybe Alex didn't say much beyond that, but anyway. By the way, more no socks, or at the very least, the socks that are only as big as the shoes, which, you know how I feel about that. Which is fine, fashion. People do whatever the hell they want to do, but not for me.
Like, we can all agree that in these pods, it's like things change so drastically. And one day it's this person and the next day it's that person.
Exactly. I feel like that's lost on people for some reason. It's such a frequent. Now, might someone be manipulative? Sure. Might someone force themselves to change their mind after they're dumped, and then they go to their number two and they're like, "You were always my number one." Sure, but it's also understandable that your mind would change. I just find that the notion that people change their minds is like a foreign notion to people. Like even the very fact of when people break up with people, like with Ben and Sarah, the way that Sarah seems to frame their ending is that he left her, which, I could see how it would feel that way, even though she was the one that said no at the altar and said, "I don't want to date him." Now, he might not have heard that. We saw that in a one-on-one interview. But anyway, and then she seems to be rewriting that history, and maybe it's true. We can't know. I somehow doubt it, but who knows, that Ben never cared for her from the very beginning, that he was fake the entire time, which is possible, but unlikely. There's certainly not data to bolster that hypothesis. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. But anyway, so that's another example of how people have a really hard time comprehending that people change their minds. You can be absolutely in love from your head to your toe, all guns a-blazing, and then you wake up one day or transition over time and you no longer are in love with that person. You might even really not want to hang out with them anymore. Things change. Minds change. It hurts. It can be disconcerting if you're the one that has the change of mind. But presumably 99.9% of relationships that end had one or more of the individuals change their mind because they at some point had one feeling and then it wasn't there and they left.
And I think that's a really normal experience. You experienced it yourself. Like, genuinely, I still think the world of you. Like, I don't fault you for anything, but I think ultimately I wanted you to be a little bit more honest.
Yeah, and she's pointing out that, well, you had that experience, that you changed your mind because you went to Meg and said that you wanted to be with her, whereas earlier you said you wanted to be with me. People change their minds. But then what did she say here?
You experienced it yourself. Like, genuinely, I still think the world of you. Like, I don't fault you for anything, but I think ultimately I wanted you to be a little bit more honest.
Okay, so I don't know why, but I appreciate it when at the reunion the cast members will at least try to be more diplomatic. You could imagine that behind the scenes Madison would have a harsher tone or more critical things. But yeah, the way she's wording it is fine, right? She's saying, I think the world of you, and that kind of phrase or that kind of sentiment sets the foundation of just like, look, I have good memories of you, and I haven't categorized you the way some people at this reunion have, based on very little information, that you're somehow a gaslighting, love bombing narcissist. I still think you're a good person, but I just wish that you had been a little bit more honest. Now, you could argue that what she's saying is you lied, but I think what she's communicating, and I would think maybe what Mason would hear, is that he was not forthcoming. Although, no, I think actually she would retain that Mason was not being honest with Meg, and particularly with Meg, that he would be committing, and actually she could use the word lie, and that is a nicer way, because it is. I mean, he could have been also changing his mind, but there was a span of time where he was being very explicit to commit to Madison, although it was very strained the way that he would say it. And there were multiple dates in there, There was a date where what it looked to be she was putting the screws to him, but I think that there's another possibility there. It definitely could be received that way. And then he's referring to other dates earlier in the day, and he's talking about how the other dates were like nothing to him. And Madison knows that Meg comes out of the date going like, "Oh my God, I'm so in love," and he said I'm his number one and all that kind of stuff. And then later that day, he, without any sort of events changing things, right? That he hadn't had a date with Madison to change his mind even, that he would say, "Yeah, all my previous dates are just nothing. They're just completely irrelevant." That wasn't the word he was using, but And I have a speculation about that he thought maybe he needs to be polite because of that pod, thing that they had on the guy's side where they just weren't talking about names or identifying these other things, and or he's not comfortable with dating multiple people at the same time. Anyway, so then he has another date with Meg, and then he has another date with Madison and reaffirms, I'm committing to you. And Madison's just like, this isn't honest. And that's what I think triggered her own abandonment, betrayal trauma from her childhood, legitimately, because it could be viably seen that way. I think I think it was a comedy of errors that both of them were coming from an understandable, relatable place, but were communicating in ways that I think were contextually relevant that led to massive misunderstandings between that's the way it kind of looked to me. And so for her, she would conclude, oh my God, this guy, at the very least you would say at the very least you could say he should be a little bit more honest, right? It's a nice way of putting it. But I think from his perspective, he was being honest as I think he can be, because I think it's hard for him to communicate. I think it's hard for him to dig down deep and actually say the kinds of things. Alex seems much more able in a different way, right? Anyway.
I know you say you don't fault Mason for anything, but you just did an interview calling him manipulative. So it's hard because I'm hearing what you're saying, but you have directly contradicted what you're saying to him right now, recently.
Interesting. So I do plan on watching news stories and TikToks and Instagrams and interviews and podcasts. I imagine there's a fair amount because there seems to be every year more and more. And sometimes it's really helpful because it fleshes things out. The whole Tyler with his kids thing was, 99% of the data that I absorbed and reacted to was post-season stuff. And without that post-season stuff, we wouldn't have known anything. And those were member videos, I believe. But anyway, so what Meg is saying is, I just saw you on a podcast or something, and you called him manipulative. And yeah, that's why. Now, maybe she can convince us here. But so on one hand, I'll commend Madison for at least seemingly having a plan to be more diplomatic. But I will ding her for, in a podcast that is just as public as the reunion, to call him manipulative. Can she say that to a friend? Can she say it to a therapist? Can she believe it? Yeah, but to just talk shit about someone without having because I have a hard time believing that Madison can make a compelling argument about that. Do we believe that Madison was manipulative? Now, I guess it depends on what she meant by manipulative, because there's a much softer version, but I'm quite sure that she meant it in the nefarious manner that it typically is used.
I'm not contradicting anything, actually. I did feel that way. Obviously, you were very vocal in the pods. You were dating Mason. You were very much like, if it's not him, then it's no one. And I could tell that you guys had a better connection than we did. So I went into my date with Mason, and I'm trying to bring that up. Like, I'm saying, you know what? I have this connection that is, a little bit better.
So I just want to pause here and absorb what she's saying, which I think is headed in the direction of confirming what I was thinking, what she was going through. Because the first time I watched in real time, I thought she had Mason as a distant second, but was strangely putting the screws to him and like forcing him almost to commit early to her when she knew that she was not going to be with Mason. And it's like, why would you do that? And of course, to the audience, it fits that sort of, manipulative, harpy vixen character that I think a lot of people think that she represents, I don't think that, honestly, because why? I mean, maybe, but not like. So I think she is, giving that rundown from her perspective of just like, I'm seeing Meg come out of the dates saying that there's this huge connection. And then when I went to ask you for clarification, so, one of the angles that I think she might be getting at is I had two guys that I was really interested in, you and Alex, and I was trying to figure out which one. I had Alex as more of a number one, but I didn't know because it was still midweek or whatever. And I'm hearing all this stuff from Meg, and so I went into a date with you, Mason, as a way to figure out if it was true and where you stood. Maybe you would have said, "Yeah, I'm really connecting with another person." But honestly, I don't know. I feel like you might be my number one. But yeah, I'm definitely kind of having a hard time deciding between two people. I think she might have said, okay, well, that's the way it looks to me. And now I know the landscape. And from that, I guess I don't really have a clarification as to what I'm going to do. But if Mason was honest, a little bit more honest, and said, well, to tell you the truth, I'm really connecting with you, but I'm really connecting with another person. And then I think Madison would have said, okay, that that helps me because I was having a hard time figuring out what to do. And that just kind of puts that to rest. So we can just say that you should be with Meg and I'll continue dating Alex. I think that's what she was trying to do, but she did it in such an obscure way. And in the edit, it looked very different to me the first time.
You seem to have a connection that's a little bit better. What are we doing about this? And he could sense that I was pulling away from this connection. And that's when you tell me that you're committed to me.
Right. So from her perspective, and this was a revelation when I rewatched everything. If you remember, you would have seen me go through this revelation that for her, she is quite sure that at the very least, he has a connection with Meg. But in her conversation with Mason, he didn't even mention it, or he might have mentioned it, if I remember right, barely. And her approach to that was in her mind, she's like, I don't think he's being honest with me. And maybe even for herself of just well, if this guy's a manipulative liar, like all the other people I've ever been with, which she would say, then I just need to run from this guy, but I can't know that because I don't know if he's a manipulative liar. So I'm really going to put the screws to him. Are you committing to me? Not as a request that please commit to me, but as a test, right? And people will do that. The more insecurely attached you are, the more likely you are to engage in these kind of tests. What some people call them are games. And they are, I guess you could say, games, manipulative, deceptive, because you're not disclosing to someone. But another way of putting it is that it's just a way of assessing whether or not you should be with someone, which you all should do, and we all do when we're dating people, right? At least passively, we're like, is this person for me? I don't know. So it could be that. And she might believe that it is not going to help to gather the information for her to be completely honest with him, that he's number two, and she's concerned. And, she did talk about Meg. She did bring that up. And she also did say that she had another strong connection. It's just, this is just further confirming what. So then when he seemingly out of the blue, as she thinks, this is her perspective, as she thinks, I'm trying to clarify the things I was saying earlier. And if he's connecting with Meg, then c'est la vie, the two of us. But as I'm trying to investigate that, suddenly now, because I'm giving him this message of look, if you're with Meg, no harm, no foul, you should be with Meg. But that wasn't what she was. If you're on his side, particularly no nonverbal, they're speaking through a speakerphone, is important to remember. So they have even less data regarding what the other person is saying. If you've ever talked to someone over the phone, it's different because what we hear in the show is the well microphoned good speakers or headphones or something version of that. But what they're talking through is a real time speakerphone situation. There could be a delay even too, maybe. So it's hard to know. And so what he thinks is, he's being asked, please reciprocate by making me your number one. And he's maybe because he's a pleaser, or he actually thought that Madison had him as number 2, but then he's interpreting all this stuff as like, oh, I didn't know. I mean, my first choice was Madison, but I was kind of conceding and pursuing Meg, and I'm really into Meg too, but originally, and then now I'm getting all this. Oh, yes, no, I'm committing to you. Absolutely. And he's not saying that because he's just worried he's going to lose Madison. But from Madison's point of view, it could look that way. And then it's doubled down over 2 dates. And in that time, she's still hearing Meg come out of the dates going like, oh my God, we're so in love. And she's like, what the hell? And so when she breaks up with him, I think she exaggerates and she takes it further and thinks that he's a clown. He is a horrible person and he deserves to be broken up with because the comedy of errors, it was reasonable for her to think that based on the very limited communication between the two of them. And that's what explains what my first pass through was what I thought to be some psychopathic shit originally, some sadistic stuff. And then now I think there's at least a possibility there because, people aren't, psychopathy and a complete lack of empathy is a thing. I've worked with people like this to varying capacities. Of course, I've studied a lot of individuals like this, con artists, pathological liars, really harmful, abusive people, and they do so out of a lack of empathy. And those people exist, but they're rare, and they tend to have full train wrecks of lives, and we're just not seeing that with these individuals. So there has to be some, in my book, explanation as to why someone would look like they have no empathy, look like they're sadistic, but actually be coming from a place where they might even be having empathy. She might have been doing all this stuff out of empathy for Meg, because from her perspective, which I think was mistaken, it would make sense if she did have empathy that she would actually try to protect Meg in that way by actually trying to interfere.
But you still continued to see Meg, and you had a date with her after that, and she comes out beaming again. And it's just like, that made absolutely no sense to me.
Right. I'll stop yammering, but that is completely in line with my second pass-through guess as to where she was coming from. And she did talk about that, but I don't think it was emphasized enough by her, at least in the edit.
And you came to me and you wanted to know if he was saying the same things to both of us. And to our conclusion, he was. And I wanted to push for honesty, not for me, but for you. And I'm sorry that was really messy, and I'm sorry I spoke for you. But yeah, I did feel a little manipulated.
I
will highlight that I don't know, that it's reasonable for her to suspect that she was being manipulated, lied to, tricked. But then we would ask, to what end? What would Mason do it? Maybe, and I think the way that Madison is wording it is that he wanted to keep his options open and didn't want to lose Madison, so he was willing to lie to both, or he was lying to one of them as a way to be selfish about holding on to his options moving forward. I think that's the typical allegation, which can happen, but I think that might be what she's saying. But the thing that I want to say is that I imagine, and she has talked about this to some extent, that she might have a long history, maybe going back to when she was very young, as a very young child, that she has experienced abandonment and lies and deception and people dropping the ball, people who suffer from addiction, parents who suffer from addiction, or spouses, friends, family members, coworkers who suffer from addiction. A very common experience if you are in their lives is that you will feel like they are frequently dropping the ball. They are frequently setting up expectations that they will be there, or that they'll pay the bills, or that they will care, or they'll show up to take you to the airport, and half the time or more, they just won't show. And there will be very little acknowledgement or very little apology. Sometimes there is, but sometimes there will just be complete ignoring of the fact that it happened, and complete denial. And you might even start keeping track of receipts or something to say, no, you said you were going to pick me up at the airport and you weren't even there, And it can be very confusing. and very, very hurtful, and particularly for kids, right? The reason why people who suffer from substance abuse or any kind of massively compelling compulsion is that the reason why they will drop the ball like that and be very not dependable is that they're in a constant cycle of use and not use and shame and denial and trying to get their hands on the substance and trying to get their hands on money to get the substance, trying to obscure the fact that they are intoxicated, obscure the fact that they're having withdrawal symptoms or that they're hungover, obscure the fact that they're dropping balls all over the place and everyone is upset. Not because they're psychopathic, but because they have trauma typically that they have found that the substance actually does help with their emotional distress spikes upon being triggered, perhaps, PTSD kinds of reactions. And they have no other way, and they've probably experimented with a lot of different ways informally to try to help them with those emotional issues. And they have determined unconsciously and consciously that the only way to manage things is to have that substance. And so anything that gets in the way of that substance is not only just uncomfortable and shaming and worrisome, but it cuts to the very core of their safety. And they might actually be right about that because they either don't know about other ways of helping themselves, or there really isn't any other answer besides harming themselves through the substance to have immediate relief from their issues. The clients that I work with along these lines, one of the things that I'm frequently having conversations with them about is that, when we're moving towards abstinence or they are experiencing abstinence, is that I'm not going to beat around the bush and I'm not going to claim, maybe hopefully they'll experience this, but it's not uncommon for them not to, that even though they have achieved abstinence and sobriety, their pain might just be beginning. And we're going to work on it, and there's short-term and long-term solutions to it. But until we get way down the road in terms of exposure therapy, which requires a lot of front work that might take years or months or something, until that happens significantly, they're going to be triggered. There's going to be emotional dysregulation. There's going to be a lack of connection with the self. There's going to be unprocessed trauma. And without that substance, you're just going to feel it, and it's going to be hard. And let's talk about how to manage it, how to manage triggers, how to manage emotions, support. What do you do? Maybe there's an antidepressant that you could take to take the edge off or something. There are some compounds, other than heroin or alcohol or crack or whatever, to help with that situation, ketamine included. And sometimes ketamine can be even prescribed, depending. Anyway, so for these individuals, it can be very hard. And so if you're a child of someone like this, you are constantly being betrayed. Your parents are everything to you, right? Think of a 4-year-old, and even things that are unsaid, right? Like in a totally normal household with a 4-year-old where the parents are at least halfway good, there's an unwritten contract that is constantly rotating. I'm putting you to bed right now. I will be here when you wake up. If you wake up in the middle of the night crying, I will hear you. I will come to you. If you get out of your bed and come to my room, I will be here. Or you'll be sleeping in the room with me. I'm putting you down in bed, and in a couple of hours, I will also sleep in this room, and you will turn over, wake up, and you will see me. I will be there. I will feed you in the morning. I will feed you at lunchtime. I will feed you at night. I will play with you. I will make sure you get to school. I will make sure you have shoes. I will make sure, there's it's constantly, I'm saying the word contract, but you get what I'm saying. Children depend on that. The parents are everything. Imagine if even just 10% of the time, the parent is not there. The parent does not deliver. The parent drops the ball. Sometimes it could be a lot more than that, right? And we heard from Madison indications that that likely happened. She gave the topic sentence, but I've heard that so many times that I can fairly confidently fill in the gaps. I'm not going to fill in the gaps because I don't know, but I've seen it so many times that some of you might be hearing me describe this and say, oh my God, that's exactly what happened to me. Well, how do I know that? Well, because it's so common. When people have the kinds of addiction and problem use, I'm just looking back at my notes. She said, I had a rough childhood. My parents never got married. They had me when they were 19. My mom was surrounded by drugs. She was in a rehab program when she met my dad. They had me by accident. She had a stepdad at age 2, and then he died when she was 13. My relationship with my mom is tough. I still talk to her when I can because it gets a bit much, because I've had to be a parent to her my whole life. There's a lot of general curses that I'm trying to break, or generational curses. My dad is super distant. My dad yelled a lot, all that kind of stuff. So I'm filling in the gaps. I don't know, but at least for a time, there's a chance that given that story that maybe 0 to 5 or something, but it's possible that throughout her life, because the way she says she's always had to be a mom to her mom. And that can create trauma around being betrayed. We can imagine that. Being lied to, being manipulated. It was happening, potentially, in all likelihood, to her. Not in this way, right? Because it's not a romantic relationship, but it is fundamental to attachment in terms of the way I'm talking about it. Dependability, loyalty, indications that the person cares about your feelings. And to have an experience like this in the pods, and again, probably a comedy of errors, and viably conclude that Mason is up to no good, that he's telling Meg one thing and me another thing, it wouldn't take much to conclude that, even just that, without any trauma. But you have the trauma, then you really exaggerate it and are really sure it's happening, because I think in another world, without her past, without her trauma, then she would suspect that, but also say like, well, I don't really know. And honestly, maybe it doesn't really matter because I don't really want to be with him. So I'm just going to move on. If I really sat down and thought about it, I might actually conclude that Mason is lying, but I don't know. This is a weird situation. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter because I have enough information. I'm looking forward. I'm going to be with Alex. And so I'm just going to break up with him and be nice and move on with life because, who knows? I think that given Madison's personality, I think that would likely have happened if the trauma hadn't been triggered. Once the trauma was triggered, and I think it was triggered early. I think when rewatching it, I think it was triggered actually on that first date. And it's funny that she is actually laying it all out. She remembers, and she's saying what I remember, which is date 1, or actually moment 1, Meg comes out of the pod, says, oh my God, I'm in love and we're each other we're number ones. Madison's like, oh, well, I guess it's over with Mason. She goes into that date and doesn't communicate well and mistakenly or communicates in a way to Mason that made it very easy for him to perceive it the other way. Mason commits to her, and Madison's like, well, okay, so then that must mean that the next time Meg comes out of the date, she is going to be crying. Not that I want that to happen, but that she will be informed by him that Mason is breaking up with her. And that doesn't happen. She comes back from another date, and Meg's even more, oh my God, I'm elated. And so if you're Madison, you're like, what the hell who is this guy, right? He is manipulative. He's lying. This is horrific. But she's like, I'm not sure. So she goes back in to another date, and he doubles down again. And she's like, well, and the disdain and the triggering would have been in part happening in that first date, which affected her body language, right? And because she didn't seem warm at all towards Mason as she was in his mind, I think, putting the screws to her. Is all this making sense? I hope so. All right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.